This is Audible.
Listener's Digest presents The Miracle Worker by William Gibson, abridged by Ermans Rajabian and narrated by Kathy Ritchie. One of the most dramatic presentations ever on Broadway has been the smash hit The Miracle Worker, described by audience reports and critics as a brilliant, powerful, hair-raising, spine-tingling, touching, and just plain wonderful play by William Gibson. The Miracle Worker is about Annie Sullivan. It tells a simple but deeply stirring story about a young woman who is hired to take care of a child who cannot hear, see, or speak, a girl who is buried alive within her small self. Annie finds her an ungovernable small animal who, with useless ears and eyes, only flails and thrashes about her arms and legs. Pity, Annie tells the bewildered family who have indulged the child, is all wrong. When, after a Homeric tussle, a kind of wild barbaric ballet, a literal knockdown drag-out fight, Annie gets Helen to eat with a spoon and fold her napkin, she feels that obedience without understanding is not enough. The battle cannot be won until Helen, through her fingers, can signal her mind, can comprehend, and communicate. The play ends with the vital connection made. All of the performances in The Miracle Worker are good, and two of them are superb, those of Anne Bancroft as Annie Sullivan and Patty Duke, age 10, as Little Miss Keller. These two, as they struggle to find each other, give thrilling performances, including one real knockdown fight between a tiny she-devil and a strong-minded young woman. During the unrestrained violence of this dinner-table combat, the play reaches its peak in one of the most nerve-shattering scenes ever acted on Broadway. Knee pads, shin guards beneath her stockings, and sponge rubber tucked under her garter belt have not been enough to protect Patty from assorted cuts, bruises, and a chipped tooth. Similar padding from ankle to bustle has not saved Annie from equally painful accidents. The impulse during rehearsal, says director Arthur Penn, was to set the fight scene to play every move in response. But then he saw his stars at work. Actress Bancroft had persuaded Patty not to hold back. "No, you come on and hit me," she said to her little colleague. So the scrap quickly developed into impromptu reality, a little different every night. The big fight has run so briefly as 8 minutes 10 seconds. At its best, one night in Philadelphia, it lasted longer than 12 minutes. It was, says Penn, one of the greatest things I've seen in the theater. Everyone, including myself, was too moved to do anything rational. We did not punch a stopwatch. The audience came out of its seats, yelling. Throughout most of the play, the audience sits tensely, witnessing Miss Sullivan's apparently losing battle to tear open the cage in which a soul is imprisoned, realizing that something extraordinary is taking place there before their eyes. For what William Gibson has dramatized in The Miracle Worker is the human intelligence, and he has dramatized it in its absence. It is night, and we are looking at a child's crib. In the lamplight we see 3 figures hovering over it. They have been through a long vigil, and it shows in their tired eyes and their disarranged clothing. One is a gentlewoman in her 20s with a kindly face, Kate Keller. The second is a dry, elderly doctor, stethoscope at neck, thermometer in fingers. The third is a dignified gentleman in his 40s with chin whiskers, Captain Arthur Keller. Their dress is that of 1880, and their voices are Southern. The Kellers' faces are drawn and worried, until the doctor says, "She'll live." At that, Kate closes her eyes. "You're lucky, Captain Keller," the doctor goes on. "Tell you now, I thought she wouldn't." "Don't spare us, doctor. Will she be all right?" Keller asks. "Has the constitution of a goat," the doctor notes. "Outlive us all." Keller takes Kate's hand and presses it as the doctor continues. "You run an editorial in that paper of yours, Captain Keller, Wonders of Modern Medicine. We may not know what we're curing, but we cured it. Well, call it acute congestion of the stomach and brain." Keller and the doctor move away while Kate, tearfully happy, adjusts the blanket. "I'll see you to your buggy, doctor," says Keller. "I won't undertake to thank you." The doctor is shaking his head. I've never seen a baby with more vitality, he says. By morning she'll be knocking down your fences again. You're a pair of lucky parents, Captain Keller. The doctor clicks a giddy app. There is the clop of hooves and roll of wheels. Keller's eyes follow the unseen buggy out of sight, then lifts to the stars, thanking them too. Suddenly, from inside the house, comes a knifing scream. Keller rushes to Kate, and we see a terrible look upon her face. She chokes down a second scream. "Look!" she cries. She passes her hand over the baby's face. "She can't see!" She takes the lamp from him and moves it before the child's face. "She can't see," she repeats in anguish. "Or hear. When I screamed, she didn't blink, not an eyelash." "Helen! Helen!" Keller cries hoarsely. "She can't hear you," cries Kate. "Helen!" He shouts it now. His face has something like fury in it, and Kate, almost fainting, takes up the baby's hand, presses it to her mouth, to stop her own cry. When next we meet the child, years have passed. We are in leaf-dappled sunlight in the yard of the Keller homestead. 3 children are on the porch steps in a litter of paper doll cutouts, and accompanied by an old setter, Belle. Helen, now 6 years old, is with the servants' children, Martha and Percy. Helen is in body a vivacious child with a fine head, attractive, but noticeably blind, one eye larger and protruding. Her gestures are abrupt, insistent, wild. Her face alone lacks lightness and never smiles. Her hand goes up quickly and fingers Martha's lips, then Percy's. Percy's teeth playfully bite at it, and the hand jerks away. "That's how I do," says Percy. "She keep poking her fingers in my mouth. I just bite 'em off." "What's she trying to do now?" Martha asks. "She trying to talk," says Percy. "She gonna get mad. Look at her trying to talk." Helen's face is scowling, the lips under her fingertips moving in ghostly silence, growing more and more frantic, until, in a child's rage, she bites at her own fingers. This sends Percy off into more laughter, but alarms Martha. "Hey, you stop now," she says to Percy. Then she pulls Helen's hands down. "You just sit quiet." But Helen's hand is again at Martha's lips, insatiable, and Martha slaps it down. Helen's fingers grope, then make a scissor-like gesture. "She wants the scissors," says Percy. Martha puts the scissors in Helen's hand, and instantly Helen has Martha on her back, knees pinning her shoulders down, and Martha's tied bunchlets of wiry hair are flying off in snips of the scissors. Percy darts to the bell string on the porch, yanks it, and the bell rings. At the sound, Kate comes out disturbed, saying, "Helen," for the 1,000th time. She hurries down the steps to them, as Martha is running off in tears, and Helen is fiercely snipping the shorn bunchlets into smaller fragments. Kate reaches for the scissors. Helen pulls them back. They struggle for a moment. Then Kate gives up wearily and lets Helen keep them. She tries to draw Helen into the house, in the end succeeds, and they go into a large old-fashioned room which serves as living room and dining room. Here there is a cradle with a sleeping infant. In the room is Mildred, Helen's little sister, Captain Keller in spectacles, who is looking over newspaper pages at a corner desk, a benign Aunt Eve with a sewing basket, putting the finishing touches on a big shapeless doll made out of towels, and an indolent young man of Kate's age, James Keller, the captain's son from a former marriage. Helen halts, her hand alert to grope, and Kate turns her to Aunt Eve, who gives her the doll, then turns to Keller. "This Baltimore occultist, I hear, just does wonders," she says. Keller shakes his head. "I've stopped believing in wonders, Aunt Eve." "But will you write to him, Captain?" Kate asks eagerly. "No," he says patiently, while James observes lightly, "Good money after bad, or bad after good." "Well, if it's just a question of money," Aunt Eve begins. "Not money," says Keller. "The child's been to every specialist in Alabama and Tennessee. If I thought it would do good, I'd have her to every fool doctor in the country." "Will you write to him?" Kate repeats. "Katie," says the captain quietly, "how many times can you let them break your heart?" any number of times," she says with a sigh. Helen has been sitting on the floor exploring the doll with her fingers, gravely, her hand passing over the face. There is no face, just a blank area, and it troubles her. She taps questioningly for eyes, but no one notices. She then yanks at her aunt's dress and taps again vigorously for eyes. The aunt does not understand, and Helen begins to go around from person to person, tapping for eyes, but no one attends or understands, as Kate says, "As long as there's the least chance for her to see or hear." "I've done as much as I can bear, Katie," says her husband. "You really ought to put her away, Father," James breaks in. "Some asylum. It's the kindest thing." "She's your sister, Jimmy," Keller says with force. "Half-sister," James comes back, "and half mentally defective. It's not pleasant to see her about all the time." "Do you dare," cries Kate, "complain of what you can see?" "What's the child want, Kate?" asks Aunt Ev, for Helen has yanked 2 beads off her dress. Helen pushes the beads into the doll's face as Kate kneels beside her, lifts Helen's hands to her own eyes in question, and Helen nods energetically. Kate takes pins from the sewing basket and pins the beads on his eyes. But Aunt Ev, who has been inspecting her dress, is displeased. "She doesn't know better, Aunt Ev," Kate says protectingly. James is shaking his head. "She'll never learn with everyone letting her do anything she takes a mind to," he says. "She could have put that child's eyes out with those scissors. Might as well pamper a wild bear cub in the house here." Wearily, Kate closes her eyes. "I know," she says, "but what else can I do? If your father won't write to this Baltimore doctor, I will." Helen now has the doll with eyes and cannot contain herself for joy. She rocks the doll, kisses it. "This child has more sense than all these men, Keller," says the aunt indulgently. "If there's ever any way to reach that mind of hers." Helen suddenly scrambles toward the cradle and unhesitatingly overturns it. The swaddled baby tumbles out, and Keller barely manages to dive and catch it in time, shouting, "Helen!" All are in commotion. The baby screams, but Helen, undisturbed, is laying her doll in its place. Until Kate, on her knees, pulls her hands off the cradle, wringing them in a desperation of anger, tears, and impotence. Helen is bewildered. "Helen, Helen," she cries in despair. "You're not to do such things. How can I make you understand?" "You've never trained an animal," James shrugs. "You teach them some discipline first thing by—" Kate flares. "How can you discipline an afflicted child? Is it her fault?" "You didn't hear me say it was her fault," James comes back. "Then whose?" Kate demands. "I don't know what to do. How can I teach her? Beat her when she won't have the faintest notion what it's about?" In the meantime, Keller has taken the infant in his arms. "Katie, it's not fair to Mildred here," he says. "We simply can't." Kate whirls upon him. "Are you willing to put her away?" Now we see on Helen's face the same darkening rage as on herself earlier, and his hand strikes at Kate's lips. Kate catches her hand, and Helen begins to kick, struggle, twist. "Now what?" James asks wearily. "She wants to talk," Kate says in despair. "Be like you and me." She holds the struggling child until there comes from Helen her first sound so far, an inarticulate, weird noise in her throat, such as an animal in a trap would make, and Kate's eyes flood with tears. She releases her, and instantly Helen puts herself back in her mother's arms, whimpering to be held. Kate embraces and soothes her. "I've a mind to take her to Baltimore myself," says Aunt Ev. "If that doctor can't help her, maybe he'll know one who can." There is a moment's silence, then Keller says slowly, heavily, "I'll write the man, Katie. Today." The doctor in Baltimore is consulted. "I can't do anything for her," he says, "but you might take her to Alexander Graham Bell in Washington." In Washington, Dr. Bell observes, "I cannot see any way into her, Captain Keller. I can suggest only that you write to Michael Anagnos at the Perkins Institute in Boston." And so they meet Mr. Anagnos of the Perkins Institute, a middle-aged, stocky, bearded man with a Greek accent. The room contains equipment for teaching the blind by touch, a human skeleton, seashells, stuffed animals, models of flowers and plants, which Anagnos touches as he walks by. The other person in the room is a young woman, far in the background. "The child's name is Helen Keller," says Mr. Anagnos. "I've written to her father, saying a governess, Miss Annie Sullivan, has been found. Well, it will be difficult there for you, Annie. But it has been difficult for you here, too. Gratifying, yes, when you came to us and could not spell your name, to accomplish so much here in a few years. But it's not easy, always an Irish battle for independence. This is my last time to counsel you, Annie," he goes on. "And you do lack tact or talent to bend. What has saved you on more than one occasion here is that there was nowhere to expel you to." Thus we meet Annie Sullivan, 21, with a face which, in repose, is grave and rather obstinate, and when active, is impudent, combative, twinkling with all the life that is lacking in Helen's, and handsome, as long as her eyes are closed. There is a certain crude vitality to her. "Your eyes hurt?" Mr. Anagnos asks. "My ears, Mr. Anagnos," she says wickedly. Now she has opened her eyes. They are inflamed, clouded by the granular growth of trachoma, and she often keeps them closed to shut out the pain of light. "What's the child like?" she asks. "No one knows," he says. "And if she is dull, you have no patience with this?" "In grown-ups you have to," she tells him. "In children it seems a little precocious. Can I use that word?" "Can you spell it?" he asks. "Well, premature," she says. "I hope she's a bright one." Anagnos shrugs. "Deaf, blind, mute, no one knows. She's like a little safe, locked, that no one can open. Perhaps it is empty. She is given to tantrums," he adds with a smile. "So am I," she says impishly. He nods. "Yes, Annie, you will find yourself among strangers now who do not know your history." "That's a kindness," she says quickly. "Perhaps you should tell it," he suggests. She bristles. "Why?" "So they will understand," he says gently, "when you are arrogant." In a teasing voice he goes on. "Some must be content with only wealth or family, not the fortune to be blind, orphaned in a state poorhouse until 14. Such things go to a young girl's head, eh? Then, not teasing, he continues, Annie, be humble. For your own sake, you will need their affection. And pity, too, she asks dryly. Child, we can all use some pity, not only the afflicted. Then crisply he adds, Well, you are no longer our pupil. We throw you into the world, a working woman, a teacher. If the child can be taught. No one expects you to do miracles, even for $25 a month. Now, in this envelope is a loan for the railroad, which you will repay me when you have a bank account. In this box, a gift, with our love. Annie opens the box. It is a garnet ring. She looks up, blinking, and down. Now, I think other friends are ready to say goodbye. As he moves to open the door, she says in a trembling voice, Mr. Anagnos, dear Mr. Anagnos. She swallows and cannot continue until she finds a woebegone joke, in tears with rueful laughter. Well, what should I say? I'm an ignorant, opinionated girl, and everything I am I owe to you. That is only half true, he tells her. Which half? She asks. I thought I died when Jimmy died, that I'd never again... Well, it's true. I haven't loved a soul since, and I never will. But this place gave me more than my eyes back, or taught me to spell it, taught me what help is and how to live again. And I don't want to say goodbye. Don't open the door, I'm crying. They will not see, he says gently. He opens the door, and a group of girls, 8 to 17-year-olds, come in. Not until they move do we see they are blind. As soon as they locate her by her voice, they throng joyfully to her, speaking all at once. Annie is down on her knees to the smallest. There's a present, they say. We brought you a going-away present, Annie. Don't go away, Annie, says the smallest child mournfully. They give her the present. Open it, they shout. Is it open, Annie? The present is a pair of smoked glasses. It's for your eyes, they say, 'cause Mrs. Hopkins said your eyes hurt since the operation, and she said you're going where the sun is fierce. Don't go away where the sun is fierce, Annie, says the smallest child mournfully. Do they fit all right? Are they pretty? They clamor. I'm putting them on, says Annie slowly. They fit fine. My eyes feel hundreds of % better already. Do you know how I look in them? Magnificent. They are delighted. There's another present, they say, for Helen, too. This present is an elegant doll with movable eyelids and a mama sound. It's for Helen, they say, and we took up a collection to buy it. It's beautiful, says Annie. I promise it will be the first thing I give her. And the smallest child says mournfully for the 3rd time, Don't go, Annie, to her. Sarah, dear, I don't want to go, says Annie gently. But I have to, because I'm a big girl now, and big girls have to earn a living. But I'll write, and I'll come back some day. So the journey begins. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Lynchburg, Roanoke, Knoxville, Chattanooga. We see Annie's face in the smoked glasses, head back on the seat, sleeping, disturbed by some dream of terror, until she jerks awake just on the verge of a scream. She sits there, trying to go back to sleep, and we see how exhausted she is, miserable and in pain, something we have not seen in her face till now, for she keeps it out, except when alone. Then we see the depot sign, Tuscumbia, and we know she has reached her destination. Miss Sullivan? The young man James Keller asks as he meets the train. Here, she says cheerfully. At last, thank heaven, I'm James Keller, he says. The name stops her. Then, her voice gentle, she says, I had a brother, Jimmy. Are you Helen's? I'm only a half-brother, he corrects her. You're to be the governess? Try, she says lightly. He is eyeing her, smiling indifferently. You look like half a governess. To this she makes no answer, and he picks up her suitcase, and they approach Kate seated in the carriage, her eyes eagerly fixed on their approach. As they near, her face grows doubtful, troubled. Then she makes it pleasant and welcoming, as James hands a stony-faced Annie in her smoked glasses up to the carriage seat and makes the introduction. Kate takes her hand, studying the girl's face, and Annie returns the gaze. A mutual appraisal of a Southern gentlewoman and a working-class Irish girl. Where's Helen? Annie asks at last. Home, says Kate. I can't wait that long. Neither can she, Kate smiles. There's been such a bustle in the house, she expects something, heaven knows what. Then she voices part of her doubt. You're very young. Should have seen me when I left Boston, Annie says resolutely. I got much older on this trip. I mean to back her, Kate says quickly. I mean to try, Annie tells her. Is it possible even, the mother asks, to teach a deaf-blind child half of what an ordinary child learns? Has that ever been done? No, says Annie. Kate's eyes lose their remaining hope as Annie continues. Dr. Howe began... Annie goes on. But an ordinary child? No, never. But then I think he made a mistake. He never treated them like ordinary children. She pauses and valiantly goes on. Don't lose heart, Mrs. Keller. I have 3 advantages over Dr. Howe that money couldn't buy for you. One is his work behind me. Another is to be young. I've got energy to do anything and nothing else to do. The third is, I've been blind. There's a pause. Advantages, Kate says quietly. Well, some have the luck of the Irish, some do not. What will you teach her first? Language, says Annie. Language is to the mind more than light is to the eye. As Dr. Howe said. Kate smiles wistfully, murmuring, Language? We can't get through to teach her to sit still. You are young to have so much confidence. Do you? Inside? Annie, who has been studying her face, likes it enough to tell her the truth. No, she confesses. I'm as shaky inside as a baby's rattle. The carriage approaches the Keller home where, inside the yard, Captain Keller is waiting. Helen is behind him. There she stands, a little motionless figure, her hair tumbled, her pinafore soiled, alone on the porch with the setter. Belle, solitary, waiting. After Annie is greeted by Keller and the amenities are over, she turns to James, who is carrying her suitcase. I'll take it, she says. Not at all, Miss Sullivan, he begins. I've got something in it for Helen, she says impatiently. Thank you. When do I see her? There, Kate points. There's Helen. There is silence. Annie, hesitant, hugging her bulky suitcase, begins the long, slow walk. They all wait motionless as Annie walks toward the steps and stops, contemplating Helen for a last moment before entering her world. Then she drops the suitcase on the porch with intentional heaviness, and Helen starts with the jar and comes to grope over it. Annie puts forth her hand and touches Helen's. Helen at once grasps it. These hands will be together for the next 50 years, and all of Helen's knowledge will flow to her through this other hand, but this is still in the future. Now Helen's hand explores Annie like reading a face. It moves from the hand to the face, over each feature, until it encounters and removes the smoked glasses, and we see Annie's eyes, grave, unpitying, very attentive. Now Helen returns to the suitcase, tries to open it, but Annie points Helen's hand overhead. Helen pulls away, and again tries to open the suitcase, and again Annie takes her hand and points it overhead. Helen points overhead, a question, and Annie, drawing Helen's hand to her own face, nods. Helen now begins tugging the suitcase toward the door. When Annie tries to take it from her, she fights her off and backs through the doorway with it. Annie stands a moment, her eyes following Helen upstairs. Then she, too, goes through the doorway. The room to which she has been assigned is on the second floor. It is large and old-fashioned, with brass bedstead and gabled ceiling. Helen is wearing Annie's smoked glasses, her bonnet, and a shawl that swamps her. She cocks her head to one side, then to the other, imitating adult action like a monkey. Annie is on the floor beside her open suitcase, watching Helen, amused, until Helen gropes toward the suitcase, and from it lifts out a pair of bloomers. "Oh, no, you don't," says Annie. Helen discards the bloomers and comes to the elegant doll underneath. Her fingers explore it, and she is at first startled, then delighted. She picks it up, taps its head vigorously, taps her own chest, and nods questioningly. Annie takes her finger, points it to the doll, points it to Helen, and touching it to her own face, also nods. Helen sits back on her heels with the clasped doll and rocks it. Annie studies her, still in bonnet and smoked glasses, like a caricature of herself, and then addresses her humorously, as one might talk to a kitten. "All right, Miss O'Sullivan, let's begin with doll." She takes Helen's hand, and into it, with fingers and thumb, she spells out the word doll, saying doll with each letter. She puts Helen's hand to the doll, repeating the action. Suddenly James's voice is heard, saying, "You spelled pretty well." Annie pulls back while Helen sits scowling, puzzled. "Finding out she's ticklish? She is," James says, leaning in the doorway, surveying the scene. Annie regards him stonily, but Helen is tugging at her hand again, imperious. Annie repeats the letters, and Helen interrupts her fingers in the middle, feeling each of them, puzzled. Annie touches Helen's hand to the doll and begins spelling into it again. "What is it, a game?" James asks. "An alphabet for the deaf," says Annie. Helen now repeats the finger movements in air, exactly, her head cocked to her own hand, and Annie's eyes suddenly gleam. "How bright she is," she says quickly. "You think she knows what she's doing?" James asks. "She imitates everything. She's a monkey." Annie takes the doll away from Helen, and at that, the child becomes incensed, and when Annie draws her hand and tries to spell into it, Helen scratches at Annie's face. Annie grasps Helen by both arms and swings her into a chair, holding her pin there, kicking, while doll, glasses, bonnet fly in various directions. To James, the scene is funny, and he laughs. "She wants her doll back," he tells Annie. "When she spells it," Annie mutters. "Spell?" James cries. "She doesn't know the thing has a name, even." "Of course she doesn't," is the reply. "Who expects her to? Now I want her fingers to learn the movements." "Won't mean anything to her," James insists. Annie gives him a look, then takes Helen's fingers, but Helen swings a haymaker, which Annie barely ducks. Doesn't like the alphabet, Miss Sullivan, says James. You invent it? Annie, struggling, dodging Helen's kicks, manages to gasp. Spanish monks, under a vow of silence, which I wish you'd take. James smiles, shrugs, and leaves. Helen is in a rage, fighting tooth and nail, but Annie suddenly remembers a piece of cake in her bag, gets it, and places it on the back of Helen's hand. Helen freezes, then she sniffs, and with her other hand reaches for the cake, and instantly Annie spells cake into her hand. Helen's hand waits, baffled, as Annie repeats the action, saying, Cake. Do what my fingers do. Never mind what it means. Helen spells the letters rapidly back. Annie pats her hand enthusiastically and gives her the cake, and Helen crams it into her mouth with both hands. Annie watches her with humor. Then she takes the doll, touches it to Helen's nose, and spells again into her hand, Doll. Think it over. Helen thinks it over, while Annie presents her own hand. Then Helen spells 3 letters. Annie waits a second, then completes the word for Helen in her palm. She hands over the doll, and Helen gets a good grip on its legs. Imitate now, understand later, says Annie. End of the first lesson. She never finishes, because Helen swings the doll with furious energy, and it hits Annie squarely in the face. She falls back with a cry of pain, her knuckles up to her mouth, and when she lowers them, there is blood on them. She works her lips, gets to her feet, coughs, spits something into her palm, finds the mirror, and bares her teeth at herself. Now she is furious herself. You little devil, she cries. No one's taught you any manners. But now the door slams, and Helen and doll are gone, and worse, the key is rattling outside in the lock. Annie darts over to pull the knob, shouting, Helen, let me out! The folly of speaking stops her. She hurries to the window and looks down, frowning then. Don't worry, she says. They'll find you. You're not lost. She looks at herself in the mirror, hair disheveled, cheeks scratched, and her eyes are disgusted with herself. She turns to a pitcher of water to wash her face. Then slowly she puts down what is in her hand. It is a broken tooth. It is not long before her plight becomes known to the family, but the key is nowhere to be found. There's only one way to get her out, and a ladder is put up against the second-story window, and Keller helps her down. Hold tight, he says. Last occasion she locked her mother in the pantry. She was there pounding for 3 hours. I'll have to have that door taken down. Down in the yard, family and servants watch the descent. Annie tries to look unembarrassed as Keller shoos away the servants, then says, Well, let's go in. James is the last to leave, murmuring to Annie with a gesture, Might as well leave the ladder, eh? Now Annie is alone in the yard. She turns toward the water pump and sees Helen, who is seated there, a picture of innocent contentment, playing with the doll. Then the key suddenly protrudes out of her mouth, and she tucks it away in the doll. Annie, leaning against the fence, studies her. Her face is impassive for a while. Then her eyes begin to twinkle, and a faint smile appears on her lips. It is a smile of respect, humor, and acceptance of challenge. Once the challenge is taken up, Annie works tirelessly, taking advantage of every opportunity to spell into the child's hand, but at the very first, she realizes that her greatest problem is discipline. Nobody here has attempted to control her, she writes to Anagnos. The greatest problem I have is how to discipline her without breaking her spirit, but I shall insist on reasonable obedience from the start. At which point, Helen's inky hand comes down with a smack on the page. Annie's hand freezes. Then her other hand patiently lifts Helen's, whose handprint overlays the page. These blots are her handiwork, she continues the letter. The more I think, the more certain I am that obedience is the gateway through which knowledge enters the mind of the child. So she continues her work with beads, stringing them, spelling the word bead into Helen's hand. With doll, with thread and needle on perforated card, the child now performing the task, now madly dashing doll or pitcher of water to the floor. But the work goes on relentlessly, resolute fingers tapping, spelling out the words upon the little palm. "What are you saying to her?" asks Kate. "Telling her it's a sewing card. is the reply. But does she know? No, she doesn't know what a word is yet. It's like talking to the fence post, puts in Keller. No, Annie says patiently. It's how you talk to baby Mildred. Gibberish. She can't understand one word until somehow she begins to. Yes, says Keller. After how many words, 1,000,000? Annie smiles. I guess no mother's ever minded enough to count. Meanwhile, her fingers continue to spell, and Helen spell back. What did she spell? Asks Kate. I spell card, says Annie. She spelled cake. It's only a finger game to her now. She's got to learn that things have names first. When will she learn? The mother asks. Annie's eyes are far away. Maybe after the 1,000,000th word, she murmurs. I would like to learn those letters, Miss Annie, says Kate. I'll teach you this evening, Annie promises. That makes only 500,000 each. In the meantime, Helen has been threading the card in a haphazard maze. As Annie tries to instruct her, Helen, impatient, gets rid of Annie's hand simply by jabbing it with the needle. Annie gasps as her hand jerks away, and Kate says, I'm sorry, Miss Annie, but that's how she is. There are times when she simply will not be interfered with. Slowly, but ominously, Annie says, I'm the same way myself. They are interrupted by a maid who announces breakfast, and so the family gathers in the dining room, and for the first time we see Helen at the table. Captain Keller and James are busy discussing their favorite topic, the Civil War. Annie, behind her smoked glasses, is watching Helen, who has left her chair and is wandering around the table. Suddenly she stops at her mother's plate, claws her hand into some scrambled eggs, takes what she wants, and crams it into her mouth. Kate catches Annie's eyes on her and smiles, half helpless, half indulgent. Helen moves on to her father's plate, messes in it with her hands, then in James's, gulping down whatever pleases her, both men so taking it for granted they hardly notice. Then Helen comes groping with soiled hands and reaches for Annie's plate, and her hand goes to it, but Annie's hand promptly lifts and removes it. Helen gropes again, and now Annie firmly pins her by the wrist and removes her hand from the table. At that, Helen begins to flail and make noises, the interruption bringing Keller's gaze around. She's accustomed to helping herself from our plates, Kate explains. I'm not accustomed to it, Annie says good-humoredly. Perhaps you can give her something, Jimmy, Kate suggests. Jimmy pokes a chunk of bacon at Helen's hand, but Helen knocks the bacon away, and again stubbornly thrusts at Annie's plate, and again Annie grips her wrists and the struggle mounts. At that, Keller turns, saying, Let her, Miss Sullivan. It's the only way we get any peace. I'll get you another plate. Without releasing the child's wrist, Annie says, I've got a plate, thank you. Kate is becoming agitated. What Captain Keller says is true, she says. She'll just persist in this until she gets her own way, we find. There is silence, except for Helen's noises as she strains to get loose. The captain is beginning to show his agitation. One plate or another is hardly a matter to struggle over with a deprived child about, he cries. Helen now begins to kick, and Annie moves her ankles. Helen bangs her toe on the chair and sinks to the floor with rage and reined injury. But Annie keeps hold of her hands while Kate hurries around to Helen. She's hurt herself, cries Keller. Never taking her eyes away from the child, Annie says, No, she hasn't. I can't bear to hear her cry, Keller tells her. Will you please let her hands? You don't know the child, Kate begs. I know an ordinary tantrum when I see one, Annie comes back. Keller is outraged. Have you no pity in you, girl? He almost shouts. Pity? Annie cries. She releases Helen to turn, equally outraged, on Keller. Pity for this tyrant, she gasps. The whole house turns on her whims. Who's to teach her the sun doesn't rise and set for her? Of course I have no pity. You do, though. You do. Kate is troubled. Please, Miss Annie, she begs. It will do no good to... Impatiently, Annie interrupts her. Because it's easier to feel sorry for her than to help her, isn't it? Stiffly, Keller stands up. I fail to see where you have helped her yet, Miss Sullivan. She turns on him. I'll begin this minute, she says, if you'll leave the room, Captain Keller. He is taken aback completely. Everyone, please, she cries. Keller is struggling with his temper. You were sent here as a paid teacher, nothing more. I can't unteach her 6 years of pity if you can't stand one tantrum, Annie tells him grimly. Mrs. Keller, you promised me help. Leave me alone with her. Will you come outside with me, Katie, at once, please, says Keller angrily, and, followed by James, they leave. The key rattles and James looks down at the lock, while Keller says angrily, Girl presumes. I'm of half a mind to send her back to Boston before the week is out. Ignorant Yankee snip. What kind of female do they breed up there? I'll teach her to keep her place. He goes out, slamming the door behind him, as James turns to Kate, saying, Father just lost the war again. Then, very seriously, he says, Don't scuttle the girl. She might deserve a chance. Inside the dining room, Annie at her place is trying to eat, though each mouthful shows how little appetite she has for it. Helen, meanwhile, is kicking, making noises, and endeavoring to pull Annie's chair out from under her. Unsuccessful in her attempt, she pinches at Annie's flank, and Annie, startled, slaps back. Thus begins the fight slowly, with a kick and a slap, gaining momentum with each move. The child, bewildered at this turn of events, runs to the door, which is locked, then runs to her mother's empty place. She touches her cheek in a gesture whose significance we still don't know. Annie pulls her to her seat, and the child kicks, claws, bites, scratches, Annie giving back as much as she is receiving, both of them breathless and disheveled. Slowly, painfully, the child is seated, compelled to hold the spoon, but her first mouthful she spatters out at Annie's face. Annie waits a moment, eyes closed, then takes a tumbler of water and dashes it into Helen's face, her hand patiently putting another spoon into Helen's. And so it goes on, until Annie emerges triumphant. Outside, Kate has been waiting in agonizing silence. Viney, the maid, goes up to Kate. Suddenly she starts toward the dining room door. I can't stand this any longer, she says to the maid. I'm going in there. But as she reaches the door, the key rattles, the door opens, and Helen blunders out like a bat out of hell, collides with her mother's knees, and clutches them for dear life. Annie appears, looking as though she has just taken Vicksburg. At her face, Kate becomes uncertain, glances from her to Helen, and Annie gives a factual report. She ate from her own plate, she says slowly. She ate with a spoon, and she folded her napkin. Kate is incredulous. Folded her napkin, she echoes. The room's a wreck, Annie goes on, but her napkin is folded. I'll be in my room, Mrs. Keller. Wearily, she begins to go up the steps as Viney says, Don't be long, Miss Annie. Lunch be ready right away. Annie shuts her eyes as a death sentence, as Kate looks after her, murmuring softly, Folded her napkin. Viney, did you hear? Helen folded her napkin. But in her bedroom, Annie closes the door and leans against it, exhausted. Her face looks very young, only a girl's face, and the tears begin to come from under the closed eyelids and down the cheeks. She moves away and falls across her bed, where she lies sobbing. It is some time later that there is a knock on the door. It is Kate, with a tray full of tea things, saying, To mark your victory. And Helen? Annie asks. Very clinging to me, says Kate. I reap the benefits. She's always been such an uncuddly child, Kate goes on. And, of course, she's my first, and has my heart in a way that— Her voice breaks. Then she goes on. You should have seen her before her illness. What eyes she had. And so happy. Do you know she began talking when she was only 6 months? She could say water. Not really, wah-wah, but she meant water. And only 6 months. Her voice is unsteady. Put up with it, please, Miss Annie. Like the lost lamb in the parable. I love her all the more. Annie is silent for a moment, and then, Mrs. Keller, she says, Helen's worst handicap isn't blindness or deafness, it's— She hesitates. It's your love and pity. I'd burn them both out of the dictionary if it was up to me. She points to her desk. I was writing a letter to say what I think of things here. It's hopeless. All of you are so sorry for her. You've kept her from becoming a human being. I don't know what you... Kate begins. What makes a human being is choosing, Mrs. Keller, between the easy things and the hard things. You've always given Helen the easy thing. She doesn't know what choice is. She won't come near me for days now, Annie goes on. It's useless for me to try to teach her language or anything else here. I might as well... But Kate stops her, fearful. Before you came, we spoke of putting her in an asylum. I visited one. There were rats, even on the... She stops, then goes on. What else are we to do if you give up? None of us can help her. Give up? Annie cries belligerently. Who told you I was thinking of giving up? It never entered my head. I just now saw what had to be done. She has to depend on me for everything. Food, clothing, fresh air. She twinkles audaciously. Yes, the air she breathes. The one who lets her have it has to be her teacher. Not someone who loves her. You have so many feelings they fall over themselves like feet. But how? Kate blurts out. It's simple enough. I'll live with her somewhere else till she learns to depend on and listen to me, for as long as it takes. I don't want it forever. I thought the garden house and back would do. Change the furniture, take Helen there after a long ride so she won't recognize it. You can see her every day if she doesn't know. Well, I'll have to discuss it with my husband, Kate says slowly. He had a different proposal. Mrs. Keller, cries Annie, I grew up in such an asylum. Rats, why, my brother Jimmy and I used to play with the rats. You're as innocent as a lamb to me, and Captain Keller too. Maybe he'd like to hear what it will be like for Helen to live with streetwalkers and people queer in the head. The room we played in was the dead house, where they kept the bodies till they could dig the... Oh, my dear, Kate cries. Annie is curt with Kate's compassion. It made me strong, she says. There is a pause, then Kate says simply, Is that what they tried to burn out of you? They didn't. Annie looks puzzled. Love, says Kate, or you wouldn't stay. I didn't come for love, says Annie dryly. I came for money. We'll talk to Captain Keller. But a little later, Keller takes a dim view of Annie's proposal. But Kate is on Annie's side. After all, she did fold her napkin, Captain, she says. Keller scowls and then, All right, Katie, he says. I consent to the garden house. We'll give them 2 weeks. Be a miracle if she lasts that long. 2 weeks? Kate cries. What can you accomplish in 2 weeks? 2 weeks, Keller insists. Then the child comes back. 2 weeks. Yes or no, Miss Sullivan? Annie's eyes are making fast calculations. 14 days, she says slowly. Maybe it's enough for only one miracle. Thus Annie comes to her decision, and so they move to the garden house, a large room with fireplace, bay window with seat, and big bed. Helen comes in groping, baffled, but interested in the new surroundings. Her parents find it hard to leave her, but they grasp Annie's hand, squeeze it, then hurry out. As the door closes with a jar, Helen rushes to it. Annie holds her off, and the child kicks her, breaks free, careens around the room like an imprisoned bird, colliding with furniture, groping wildly, repeatedly touching her cheek, her sign for her mother, in growing panic. She then begins her weird screaming. Annie leans against the door, her face disturbed, murmuring to herself a bit grimly. 2 weeks. Well. Obedience is the gateway through which knowledge enters the mind of the child, Annie has written to Anagnos, and to Kate she has said, She has to depend on me for everything. And so, alone with the child for the first time, she begins what appears to be the hopeless task of breaking through the gateway of Helen's mind through discipline and a sense of utter dependence. The grueling job begins with the first meal served, brought to the garden house by the servant. Annie takes the plate to Helen, who has been sitting on the floor in a kind of exhausted stupor. Annie revives her with the smell of food, but as Helen reaches for it with her hand, Annie puts the plate on a stool, puts a napkin around Helen's neck, and the spoon in her hand. But Helen drops the spoon and again reaches with her hand, and Annie deftly removes the plate. Helen sits darkly, hand on an empty stool, then gropes, retrieves the spoon, and sits with it in hand, waiting. Annie restores the plate, and Helen begins eating with the spoon, avidly. But there is more trouble that night. The room is in lamplight. Annie, in a voluminous old nightgown, gathers the litter of dolls and Helen's clothes, which she hangs with wry gentleness. Helen, also in a little old-fashioned nightgown, is already in bed. Annie turns out the lamp, lifts the blanket, slides in beside her. But as soon as her body touches Helen's, the child bounds out on the other side. Annie sits up on an elbow, looks at her in the moonlight with a "what now" expression, saying softly, as if to herself, "You'll take cold." She gets out of bed, takes a doll, and with it leads Helen back to bed. But no sooner is she herself in than Helen jumps from the bed again. Annie gazes at her wearily, saying, "Oh my, here we go." She gets up again to lead Helen back, and Helen now fights. But this fight in the semi-darkness is different, in that Helen conducts it in a tight-mouthed silence. She kicks, strikes, bites, hangs like a dead weight, springs like a cat, is dumped back in bed, rolls out, and begins all over again, but with not one scream out of her. All we hear is her panting and Annie's heavy breathing. Now Annie picks her up and throws her into bed with such force that the bed collapses. Helen is out of it, waiting for the next move, while Annie, worn out, sits on a chair, a smile twisting her mouth. "What makes you such a pig-headed little jackass?" she murmurs. "Don't you know I'm a pig-headed big jackass? You don't stand a chance." She rises and begins to reassemble the bed. "I have all night, if you have." Helen makes a defensive move, as Annie says softly, "Don't be impatient. First things first." In the main house, the lights go out one by one. Then a figure comes out for a stroll. It is James. He stops to light a cigar, and is about to continue when he hears Annie's voice crooning a lullaby. He listens curiously, then makes his way to the bay window of the garden house. The room in moonlight is a post-battle shambles, chairs overturned, rugs out of place. The clock says 11:40. Helen is in bed already, curled up tight near her own edge. Annie, in a rocker, is crooning, but not to Helen. It is to Helen's doll, which she is rocking against her breast. She herself, in her nightgown, looking like a small child playing mamma. James lowers his eyes, a little ashamed of witnessing Annie with her bristles down. Then he turns away, his gaze far away. Perhaps he is remembering another mother. A cock crows. It is another day. In the garden house, breakfast has been served, but has not been consumed, for Helen sits on the floor in her nightgown, a picture of stubbornness and despair, surrounded by her scattered clothes. She touches her cheek in her mother sign, waits a moment, then sighs. Annie watches her and waits for the difference of opinion to resolve itself, for she thinks Helen should dress herself, and Helen thinks she should not. For a long time Helen sits, her face darkly scowling, her fists closed and obstinate. Then one of them rather sneakily edges over until it encounters her shoe. Her fist opens one finger, and the fingertip on the shoe begins to describe a slow, thoughtful circle. The difference of opinion has been resolved. These are to be important history-making days, but to Annie they only constitute the days of the 2 weeks she has alone with Helen, and we are aware of the emotion that must be hers as she crosses out on the calendar marked March, Friday, the 12th, and Saturday, the 13th. Wearily she goes to Helen, her fingers trying to penetrate the little closed fist. But since their arrival in the garden house, that fist has remained stubbornly closed, and it will not open now. Then the door opens, and in comes Percy with a tray full of food. Helen sits quiet and docile on the floor in a ring of her dolls, taking no interest in them. Suddenly Annie takes from the tray a piece of cake and a cup of milk. "Want to play a game, Percy?" she asks. He is suspicious. "Don't want to play no doll's game." No dolls, she says. A big grown-up game. She leads him to Helen and opens his palm, touching it with her fingers. This is how I play, talking to Helen. It's not really talking. She doesn't know what words are yet. But we make letters. This one is E. Can you do it? She shows him. He tries it. She corrects his thumb. Show Helen, she says. He touches the back of her fist, and she draws back automatically, but she sniffs. Then her fist opens in recognition and begins to grope for Percy. Percy makes the letter in Helen's palm, and at once she makes it in his. He is surprised. She'd do it back. Oh, Helen knows lots of letters. Here's a C and an A. Try them. He tries the 2 letters in Helen's hands, and quickly she spells 4 letters back. Huh? He cries. She made cake, says Annie. She doesn't know yet that it means this. She breaks a piece and gives it to Helen, who eats it. Annie smiles. Isn't it funny she knows how to spell it, and she doesn't know she knows? That's the game, to get her to know she knows. Now, here's cake. No, this way, little fingers down. Now, you can say it back to her. Percy, with interest, spells into Helen's hand, but gets the letters mixed up. Helen chokes on the cake with amusement, and she grabs his hand and manipulates his fingers, teaching him. He tries, succeeds, and she pats him on the head so vigorously he winces. She then quickly makes 3 letters. She's showing off, said Annie. She made the letters for cup. Would you like to learn one she doesn't know? Milk. Milk, like this. Helen's hand questions what theirs are up to. Annie lightly brushes it away and continues. Helen tries again to get in, and again Annie brushes her hand away. Helen's hand insists so vehemently now that Annie admits it and spells alternately into each palm. The 2 children are competing now for her hands to spell back into. We move now from the hands to the calendar, which is Tuesday, March 16th, and then back to the hands, with Annie teaching Helen to crochet, saying, In and under, yes, good. She cannot help it. She bends with her mouth to touch Helen's braid, and instantly Helen's face freezes, her head averts, and Annie's face has lost its gaiety. It is Friday the 19th, and we hear Annie's voice almost pleading. There's only one way out for you, and it's language, to learn that your fingers can talk. And her hand spells into Helen's, the same thing over and over. That your fingers can say anything, anything you can think. This is water, water, Helen. It has a name. The child spells out the word, but that is all. It is heartbreaking, backbreaking, with absolutely no result. I feel every day more and more inadequate, she writes in Agnos. My mind is undisciplined. If only there was someone to help me. I need a teacher as much as Helen. I need help too. She takes the child's hand and spells into it. How do I reach you? Slowly, irrevocably, the days go by. The end comes. The calendar has been marked through Thursday the 25th. Annie is staring at it, pencil in hand, and slowly she marks the final X on the 26th. 2 solid weeks of X's. Now we see Keller coming with the setter, Belle. I brought Helen a playmate, he says. I'll send Viney to help you pack tomorrow. We are all so excited at having her back. I need more time, Annie cries involuntarily. Another week. Suddenly Helen lifts her head, sniffs, gropes around the room until she encounters Belle, and throws her arms around the dog's neck. See how homesick she is, says Keller. And we miss her too much. What would another week accomplish? You've done so much better than I thought was possible. Her manners are so much improved. She has to learn that everything has its name, Annie cries, with desperate impotence. That words can be her eyes. What is she without words? With them she can think, have ideas, speak, be reached. There's not a thought or fact in the world that can't be hers. You publish a newspaper. Do I have to tell you what words are? And she has them already. 18 nouns and 3 verbs. They're in her fingers now. I need only time to push one of them into her mind. One, and everything will follow. Give me time. Suddenly Keller points. Helen is playing with Belle's claws, spelling into them. What is she spelling? Keller asks. Tonelessly, Annie says. Doll. Keller shakes his head. Teaching a dog to spell. Dog doesn't know what she means, and she doesn't know what you mean. If God had meant Helen to have eyes, he would have given her them. I'll send Viney to pack in the morning. Abruptly he leaves the room, and slowly Annie walks to the bed and stands there defeated, murmuring, I didn't do it. Didn't and can't. She looks at Helen and her eyes fill. I don't know how, Helen. Not a soul in this world knows how. Thus comes the last night in the garden house for the two asleep on the bed. In the moonlight streaming in through the window, we can see that Annie's face is disturbed by some dream of growing terror. It lifts her up in a nightmare sweat. Her hand under the blanket gropes and touches Helen's body, and at that, a scream breaks from her throat. The scream is a name. Jimmy! It shocks her awake, and she stares at Helen, and as though still in the nightmare, we hear a faraway voice saying, Yes. Annie shuts her eyes with a choking moan, stumbles out of bed, and at the basin, splashes her face with water. But this is no nightmare. It is James Keller who is standing at the bay window. Quickly, Annie throws a shawl around herself. I take a turn around here each night, he explains. See that all's well. She sinks onto the window seat. A dream? He asks. She nods. How old was he, your brother? She looks down. 7, Helen's age. How'd he die? He couldn't walk any more. She's now talking out the dream, experiencing it. He had a bunch on his hip the size of a teacup, a tubercular hip, they said. Kept growing. We lived together in the women's ward to be near each other. Jimmy had to wear a girl's apron to stay. We were a pair, all right, me blind and him on a crutch in that apron. He kept saying, It hurts, it hurts. Then he couldn't walk, even with a crutch. I was asleep when it happened. I didn't hear them roll his bed out. But I woke up and felt it wasn't there. So I went into the dead house in the middle of the night and found his bed. And under the sheet I felt his skinny ribs. When I screamed, it woke everyone. They dragged me off him. That's the part I dream. How long ago? He asks. 11 years. And you've had no one to dream about since? No, she says grimly. You don't let go of things easily, do you? No, she says again. That's the original sin, giving up. Jimmy gave up. James is silent for a moment, then he says, Perhaps Helen will teach you. She looks at him, a question in her eyes. There is such a thing as defeat, he says, and no hope, and giving up. Sooner or later we do. Then maybe you'll have some pity on all the Jimmies, and Helen for being what she is, and even yourself. With stony face, Annie sits for a moment. Then without another word she closes the window on him and walks in the semi-darkness to the bed, when she goes to her knees beside Helen, murmuring, No, I won't let you be. No pity, I won't have it, on either of us. God didn't mean you to have eyes, I do. We're dead a long time. The world isn't something to be missed, I know, and I won't let you be till I show you it, till I put it in your hand. She puts her lips to Helen's hand, but Helen, even in her sleep, tugs it free and rolls away, and Annie closes her eyes on her aloneness. It is a moving reunion the next morning. Annie is spelled into Helen's hand, Mother, lifting Helen's hand to her cheek in her mother sign. She repeats the sign, then pushes the child forward, and now Helen understands and begins groping, trembling, herself, as Kate rushes to clasp her in her arms, kissing her frantically. Back home it is a happy family group, Helen unwrapping homecoming presents, while her parents beam, and even Aunt Ev, who is back, smiles at the child's quiet deportment. But upstairs in her room Annie does not share in the sense of achievement felt by the family below. But there's a knock on the door, and it is Captain Keller with an envelope in his hand. I've been waiting to give you this, Miss Annie, he says. Your first month's salary. It doesn't express what we feel. It doesn't even pay for what you've done." "What have I done?" she asks dully. "Taken a wild thing and given us back a child. You've taught her so much that we couldn't." "I taught her 2 things," she said flatly. "Yes and no. Can do and can't do." "It's more than all of us could in all the years he begins. "I wanted to teach her what language is," she cries earnestly. "Perhaps you will," he tells her. She shakes her head. "I don't know how. I know without it she's in a dungeon. With it we're all kinfolk, at least we can talk. All I know is to go on and have some faith that inside it's waiting like water underground. All I can do is keep on." "It's enough for us," he says. She takes a step toward him. "You can help, Captain Keller. Even learning yes and no has been at a cost. Don't undo it. The world isn't an easy place. To let her have her way in everything is a terrible injustice to her." Her eyes fill. It takes her by surprise, and she laughs at it. "And I don't even love her. She's not my child. You've got to stand between that injustice and her, because I will, as long as I'm here." "We will," he answers her. "We've learned something too, I hope. Won't you come down to us?" Together they go down to the dining room where all are assembled. Annie's chair is, as before, next to Helen's. There is a general babble of voices until Annie asks for the pitcher of water. And as she fills Helen's glass, she sees the child's napkin on the floor. She retrieves it and puts it around Helen's neck again, and this time sees Helen deliberately yank it off to throw it on the floor. Annie's face grows quiet, as does the talk around the table. Annie, with all watching in silence, now picks the napkin up and puts it on Helen, and Helen throws it down. Annie rises and bears Helen's plate away, and Helen, feeling it gone, begins to kick the table, and as Annie takes her hand to lead her away, Helen grabs her mother's arm. "Miss Annie," Kate says pleadingly, "it's a special occasion." For a second Annie hesitates, then, "No," she says firmly, then turning to Keller. "Captain Keller," she appeals. "We had a little talk, Kate," Keller says to his wife. "Miss Annie feels that if we indulge Helen in— But what's the child done?" Aunt Ev wants to know. Kate sighs wearily. "What is it you want to do?" she asks. "Take her from the table." "Oh, let her stay. My goodness, she's only a child," Aunt Ev puts in. "She doesn't have to wear a napkin if she doesn't want to." "You must not interfere," Annie cuts in. "This once, Miss Annie," Kate insists. "She's testing you," Annie warns her. "She's home. She wants to see what will happen. I know it hurts you, but to teach her everything can't be as she wants is bound to be painful to everyone. She'll live up to what you ask of her. Keep her to what she's learned, and she'll learn more." Keller rises. "All right," he says. "I'll keep her to it, but not by sending her from the table. Bring her plate back," he tells Viney. "I won't see a child of mine deprived of food." "If she was a seeing child, none of you would put up with such." "But she's not," Keller says crisply. "Bring her plate, please." Annie's jaw sets, but she gets the plate while Keller fastens the napkin around Helen's neck. Helen permits him, and Keller says, "It's natural enough. Most of us don't like our teachers." He puts a fork in Helen's hand and starts back. Helen sits motionless, thinking things over. Then, with a wicked glee, she deliberately flings the fork on the floor. Then, after another moment's thought, she plunges her hand into her food, crams a fistful into her mouth, and plunges her other hand into Annie's plate. As Annie moves to grasp her wrist, Helen, anticipating the move, flings out her other hand, encounters the water pitcher, and she swings with it at Annie. Annie blocks it with an elbow, but the water flies over her, and the pitcher tumbles to the floor. Annie gets her breath, snatches up the pitcher in one hand, snatches up Helen with the other, and starts to carry her out kicking, but Keller is in her way. "Don't interfere," she warns him. "Don't undo what I do. I treat her like a seeing child because I ask her to see. I expect her to see. Don't—" "Where are you taking her?" Keller asks. "To make her fill this pitcher again." "We have servants to fetch water," he says coldly. "Don't interfere with me in any way," Annie repeats. She plows past him with Helen under her arm as Aunt Ev, astounded, says, "You let her speak like that, a girl who works for you." "No, I don't," he says angrily. He is starting after her when James stands up, more resolute than we have ever seen him. "Let her go," he says quietly. Startled, Keller turns upon him and almost shouts, "What?" "I said let her go. She's right, and you're wrong." Outside, Annie is hurrying down the porch steps, pulling Helen by her hand to where the water pump stands. When they reach it, Annie grimly puts Helen's hand on the pump handle. "All right," she says. "Pump." Helen touches her cheek and waits uncertainly. "No, she's not here. Pump." She forces Helen's hand to work the handle, then lets go. And Helen obeys. And as the water comes, Annie puts the pitcher in her other hand and guides it under the spout, and the water tumbling into it douses Helen's hand. Annie takes over the handle and automatically does what she has done so many times. She spells into Helen's free palm, saying, "Water, water, it has a—" Suddenly, the miracle happens. Helen's face changes, looks startled. Some light comes into it we have never seen there, some struggle in the depths behind it, and her lips tremble, trying to remember something the muscles around them once knew, till at last it finds its way out painfully. A baby sound, buried under the debris of years of dumbness. "Wah! Wah!" She drops the pitcher and it shatters. She stands transfixed as she repeats over and over again, "Wah! Wah!" Annie stands there motionless, unable to believe that the miracle has happened, and watches as Helen plunges her hand into the water and spells into her own palm. Then she gropes frantically for Annie's hand and spells into it. "Yes," cries Annie. Helen spells into it again. "Yes," repeats Annie. Helen grabs at the handle, pumps for more water, plunges her hand into its spout, and spells again and again into Annie's hand, as Annie shouts, "Yes, yes! Oh, my dear!" She falls to her knees to clasp Helen's hand, but Helen pulls it free, stands almost bewildered, then drops to the ground, pats it swiftly, holds up her palm imperious, and Annie spells into it, "Ground." Helen spells it back. Helen whirls to the pump, pats it, holds her palm, and Annie spells into it, "Pump." Helen spells it back. "Yes, yes!" Annie shouts. Helen is now in such an excitement, she is possessed, wild, trembling, turns, runs, encounters a trellis, shakes it and thrusts out her palm, and Annie spells into it. Helen has no time to spell back now. She whirls, groping to touch anything, falls on the porch step, slaps it, reaches out her palm, and Annie, while spelling into it, cries wildly at the house, "Mrs. Keller! Mrs. Keller!" Helen scrambles onto the porch, groping, and finds the bell string, tugs it, the bell rings. All the bells in the town seem to break into speech, while she reaches out, and Annie spells feverishly into her hand. The door opens, and Kate and Captain Keller hurry out. Helen, still ringing the bell, with her other hand touches her mother's skirt, and Annie spells into her hand, "Mother." Keller now grabs Helen's hand, and Annie again spells, "Papa." "She knows!" Annie shouts in exultation. "She knows!" Kate and Keller go to their knees, stammering, clutching Helen to them, and Annie steps back to watch the threesome. Suddenly, Helen gropes, feels nothing, turns all around, pulls free, and comes with both hands groping to find Annie. She encounters Annie's thighs. Annie kneels to her. Helen's hand pats Annie's cheek impatiently, points a finger and waits, and Annie spells into it, "Teacher." She holds Helen's hand to her cheek, but Helen withdraws it, not jerkily, but only with reserve, and then retreats a step. She stands thinking it over, then turns and stumbles to her parents. They take her to them, and Helen now begins to weep, not weirdly, but softly, radiantly, and like an ordinary child. At last the day is over. It has been an exhausting day for everyone, but above all, for Annie. It is evening now, and as darkness falls, Annie sits in a rocker on the empty porch alone. In a moment the door opens, and Helen comes out in her old-fashioned nightgown. She feels her way across the porch, rather shyly, and when she touches Annie's chair, she stops. Neither moves for a moment. Then Helen creeps into Annie's arms and, lifting her face, kisses Annie on the cheek. Annie gathers her on, and they hold each other, cheek to cheek. They are motionless, but their hands are talking to each other. Helen spelling into Annie's, "Teacher, teacher," and Annie spelling something back, just what we do not know, until we hear Annie's voice, unsteady, whispering, "I love Helen." Time is flying. A tree is letting go of its autumn leaves, and the leaves are settling around a pumpkin on its vine. And we see another pumpkin with a face cut into it and a lighted candle within, and Helen's hand and Annie's hand exploring it and speaking to each other in a fast dance of fingers. And at a window, snow is falling, and inside the family is decorating a Christmas tree, with Helen hanging her decorations too, and laughing. And next we see a flower bed outside, in which the tulips are poking up out of the ground, and Helen is planting her doll by the feet, and pantomiming to Annie how she expects the doll to grow as tall as herself. Annie is writing, as she has always done, to Michael Anagnos. "She's a wonder. Yesterday she asked me, 'What is a soul?' I said no one knew, but that we know it isn't the body. It's invisible, and it's the part of us that thinks and loves and hopes. And you know what she answered? 'But if I write what my soul thinks, it will be visible, and the words will be its body.'" She pauses, and as we look upon her face, we perceive its radiance, and we know that we will not see a more fulfilled face.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.